Welcome to the deep dive. Our job here is to take a stack of challenging source material, the history, the forecasts, the personal anxieties, and give you, the learner, some clear, prioritized context. You're navigating, well, let's face it, an environment just overloaded with information and constant global tension.
Precisely. And today's mission, it's really to move beyond just the headlines. We're analyzing a unique blend of sources here. We've got historical documents looking at the psychology behind preparing for conflict, some deep dives into personal financial fears, and frankly, some pretty high-stakes, specific geopolitical predictions. We're trying to connect the dots, between how wars actually start and how we as individuals try to maybe secure ourselves against all this instability.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. And we're going to ground this whole conversation, really ground it, by looking at a tangible piece of history, a newspaper. Specifically, the WWIII, dated August 31st, 1939. This paper, it cost 10 groszy, and what's absolutely critical is that date. It's literally hours before the start of World War II.
Yeah, that document is just a masterclass in historical irony, isn't it? The main headline, which we've got right here in the source material, it reads, Hitlerowi pozostaje do wyboru kofnąć się albo rozpocząć wojnę, which means Hitler has the choice to retreat or start a war.
And the subheading is just as resolute, declaring, Polska czeka gotowa z bronią u nogi. Poland waits ready with a weapon at its foot. So they felt ready, but they were still speculating right up until the actual moment of catastrophe.
And the crucial psychological insight here, which the source material really emphasizes, isn't that people were ignorant, it's that they were exhausted. The constant speculation about war leading up in September 1939 had kind of rendered the word war ineffective. The term used in the source, Weisrichtung, it suggests the word itself was just, well, worn out.
That's an incredibly important concept, I think. If your brain is constantly told disaster is coming, but nothing happens day after day, it starts to tune out the threat, right? So if the word war was worn out in 1939, what's the modern equivalent we're becoming fatigued by today? Is it maybe recession? Or pandemic? How do we even recognize that kind of tuning out now?
Well, that fatigue, it acts like a cognitive filter, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When a massive threat just drags on, we naturally shift our focus. We look at immediate, maybe solvable problems. And that makes the huge catastrophic risk feel less imminent. It's a coping mechanism, sort of. The sources even point out the story of the clairvoyant, Stefano Sawicki. He kind of illustrates this confusion. Apparently, he was telling different groups conflicting things, publicly suggesting Poland would somehow avoid WWII, while privately, the source says, he was actually deeply fearful of what was coming. It just highlights how desperate people were for any reassurance, even if it was contradictory.
So the lesson from history, really, despite all the grinding political buildup, is that conflict itself is always characterized by starting suddenly, unexpectedly. And that suddenness, it just immediately strips away any sense of safety we got from being tired of hearing about it.
Exactly. And that profound suddenness is why the sources then immediately shift to addressing these specific modern anxieties, the kind you might be facing right now. These worries, whether it's about selling a house or securing property somewhere else, they're attempts to regain some control when faced with this uncontrollable global threat.
Yeah, we saw that so vividly reflected in just the sheer volume of specific, really micro-focused questions the source material references. Things like, should I sell my house? Will the borders be closed? Will I even be able to travel in a few months? It sort of takes the vast, terrifying prospect of war and shrinks it down to a very focused personal logistics problem.
And the most poignant example cited was this man who called from Turkey. Now, he lives in Poland, but he was having this multi-stage, quite expensive dental implant procedure done over in Turkey. He'd paid for the whole thing up front. And he was calling, not really worried about the grand geopolitical landscape, but solely focused on this single prepaid service. His question was basically, will the borders be closed in 3 months? Will I be able to get back for the second stage of my implants?
Wow, that level of focused anxiety, I mean, it's heartbreaking in a way, but is it rational? If the sources define conflict as sudden and violent, how helpful is worrying about a prepaid dental implant, really, compared to maybe worrying about someone who has nothing invested like that? What does the analysis say about that psychology, focusing on these small anxieties to maybe mask the huge, unmanageable risks?
Well, the analysis suggests we focus on the manageable losses precisely because the truly unmanageable ones, the immediate fallout of conflict, are just too terrifying to really contemplate. The source material synthesizes the immediate impact of sudden conflict, and it's instantaneous, total upheaval. We're talking mandatory call-up, conscription, immediate declaration of martial law, instant rationing of food and energy, and drawing on historical precedent. like WWII, the immediate dimming of cities, plus severe travel restrictions.
So it's the instantaneous withdrawal of access and control over your own life, just gone. And that brings us neatly to the analysis of money during conflict. If that psychological fatigue distracts us from the big picture, what happens when we lose material control?
The source is absolutely clear on this. Domestic, fiat money instantly collapses in value in a conflict scenario. It just plummets. But then the analysis shifts to cryptocurrencies, which are described as contractual money or monum pieniutem. This kind of money, by its very nature, relies entirely on the principle of faith, just the collective belief in its digital value.
Okay, and here's where the fragility becomes really paramount, isn't it? That faith comes with this singularly crucial vulnerability that, say, traditional banking doesn't have.
Exactly. When you use fiat currency in a traditional bank, the institution itself guards your money. If you lose your bank PIN or your credit card gets stolen, you can still prove who you are, right? And the administration, the bank, restores your access. There's a safety net. However, the analysis highlights this critical flaw with crypto. If you lose the ciphers, the codes, ciphri as the source puts it, for your Bitcoin or whatever crypto, you lose everything permanently.
There's no safety net, no administration guarding the asset for you.
None whatsoever. The source material really hammers this distinction home. Crypto relies on the individual being the sole perfect guardian of their keys. If those keys are lost, compromised, whatever, the currency doesn't just fall in value like fiat might. The source suggests it could literally vanish entirely from your access. The loss is total and completely unrecoverable because there's no mechanism for proving your identity and getting access restored. It really emphasizes the fragility of anything that relies solely on a digital structure when the physical world might be collapsing around it.
Right. Understanding that fragility, that sudden unrecoverable loss, it gives us the context we need now to tackle these geopolitical flashpoints that the sources provide. And they paint a very challenging, a global strategic forecast.
Yes, we begin with a message that was relayed from Krzysztof Woźniak. It deals with how narratives, political stories can flip under pressure. He apparently claimed he was correct in a previous, quite controversial prediction. Poland accused of starting the war in Ukraine.
Okay, hold on. Poland accused of starting the war. How does the source explain the reasoning behind that kind of speculation? It sounds counterintuitive.
It does. The explanation in the source material is complex. It argues that because Poland has provided such extensive and absolutely crucial support for Ukraine, eventually the political narrative could be reversed by adversaries. The idea is that this immense aid could be framed, twisted perhaps, into being seen as incitement, that Polish actions rather than Russian aggression were somehow the true cause of the war's scope or its continuation. It's a pretty dark example of how geopolitical gratitude, or maybe just involvement, could potentially be warped into blame later on.
Okay, I see the logic, however unsettling. So from that potential narrative flip, where do we go next?
Now we shift to the really high-stakes scenario involving Israel, Iran, and the global powers. This is centered around Netanyahu's alleged strategy, which the source details in, well, quite considerable depth.
All right. So the material claims that Netanyahu views Hamas as essentially dismantled for practical purposes, but he's now consumed by the need to retrieve the captured hostages. And the analysis suggests he's preparing for a major war with Iran and actually plans to deploy a serious bomb on Iranian targets.
That's what the source claims, yes. And the vision provided in the material is stark. It says if this strike occurs, the media the very next morning will show a distinctive image, a huge column of smoke, described as extremely tall, visible from an immense distance. This is presented as the sort of physical signature of the planned strike.
Wow. But this isn't planned as just an isolated attack, is it? The strategy, according to the source, is tied into a much wider geopolitical chess game involving Russia and China.
Correct. Russia and China are allegedly supplying Iran, according to this source. So the source outlines Netanyahu's strategy as using Ukraine as a form of leverage.
Leverage how?
The material claims he intends to give Ukraine specific weapons chosen to irritate Russia significantly. The goal, allegedly, is to encourage Russia to make the strategic mistake of engaging more heavily, perhaps bogged down, with Europe. And that would divert Russia's attention and its military energy away from the Middle East and, critically, away from defending Iran.
That is an incredibly complex and calculated risk. Trying to weaponize one conflict to distract the key players, the backers, from another one entirely. What happens after this alleged strike on Iran?
Well, following the devastating strike, which again is allegedly designed to prevent Iran from even standing on its feet, Israel would then issue a very short, brutal ultimatum. issued to the surviving powers, threatening further attacks if that ultimatum isn't met.
And the scope and timeline mentioned in this analysis, they're huge. The source suggests that this action, if it happens, could open the door to a world war, or at least a massive continental conflict, potentially lasting until 2028. Is there any critical analysis within the source material suggesting an alternative path? Or is this prediction based solely on this kind of fixed sequence of strategic escalations?
The source presents this primarily as a dominant forecast, relying on these calculated steps. It doesn't offer much in terms of alternatives, unfortunately. And furthermore, just to add context regarding Gaza, the analysis states Netanyahu knows his actions there, where the infrastructure is described as completely demolished, are ruthless. But allegedly, he believes worse things will happen and more people will die globally. He supposedly views the ongoing conflict in Gaza as merely an appetizer. The Polish word used is zapałka for the much larger conflict he anticipates ahead.
Okay, so we've gone from the psychological exhaustion back in 1939 to modern anxiety over losing access to, of all things, dental implants, and then the potential for total unrecoverable loss of financial security via crypto. And finally, these vast, very specific geopolitical forecasts that seem to put the globe on a potential long-term path to major conflict, maybe through 2028.
Yeah, the synthesis of all these different sources leaves us with, I think, a singular core insight. It's that conflict is not some sensational film that we just passively watch, waiting for the dramatic climax. It's a profound, messy tragedy. And it only becomes truly real when it brings injustice, harm, and specific unrecoverable losses directly to you. The loss of your ability to plan ahead, to travel, to access your own money, or even like that man, to complete basic medical care.
It fundamentally strips away your ability to make even simple choices for yourself.
Precisely. So it's sudden, it's violent, and it brings total unrecoverable upheaval. And we are now looking at forecasts suggesting the worst might still be ahead, potentially lasting until 2028. Does our current focus, maybe your current focus, on preparing for specific smaller outcomes, like moving a bank account or securing a vacation home, does that fundamentally miss the point?
Right. Are we truly prepared for the sudden, absolute loss of access and control that seems to define historical conflict? Or are we perhaps just focused on preparing for the inconveniences, the manageable bits? That really is the question the sources ultimately leave you with, the learner.
Indeed. It's something to reflect on. The difference between just speculating about the worst-case scenario and actually building genuine resilience against that sudden loss of agency, of control. We'll see you next time.